Now, what is happening here is a protest that is ongoing against corruption and crime. Many hundreds of people gathered there. There has been use of tear gas in previous shots. Now, the Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has criticized this march. She has called it a movement financed by right-wing politicians and business leaders who oppose her government.
So we are starting to witness some really interesting political developments just south of the border this week in what could have potentially massive ramifications for the United States itself. This could be an opportunity, I would argue, for us to finally affect a positive regime change for once. You know, we've watched the globalist ruling class do so many useless wars and negative topplings of governments for the past several decades, but here is an opportunity to do one that would not only better the lives of the Mexican people, but massively the American people, because after all, we know about the migration and crime and drug problems that have stemmed as a result of the instability of Mexico and many Latin American nations. And that is why I find it so interesting that this week the Mexican people are essentially saying, we're fed up with that too. We don't want the cartels to be running our country either, because just today, in a massive event, thousands of protesters in Mexico City apparently tried to storm the National Palace in protest against left-wing President Claudia Sheinbaum for being a quote-unquote narco president, essentially accusing her there of being bought off by the cartels, which every politician in the country of Mexico essentially is in one way or another. You wonder why the cartel runs the country. You wonder why the cartel often has more power than the government, because they essentially are the government, right? In a sense, you could almost say that Mexico itself is a failed state. But nonetheless, I do want to show you here apparently what is happening, why it is happening, because, you know, there's been a lot of Latin protests against working too much or for some socialist cause. That's not what's happening here. They're just directly saying, we're tired of crime, we're tired of corruption, which is highly ironic because when you look at a lot of the American leftists, they, of course, celebrate the cartels. They say it's bad that Trump is going after them. You can't designate the cartels as a terrorist organization. Even you do see some far left activists who are trying to make an alliance right now to put bounties on the heads of ICE agents. And meanwhile, this is how the Mexican people actually feel. Although if you've been following some of our smaller stories throughout the last several months, you wouldn't be surprised because there's actually a big disconnect between the way people in Mexico feel and like Latino people or leftist people in America actually feel about the same issue. Because in Mexico, just earlier this summer, they had a mass protest against what? Foreigners, right? They were essentially tired of American tourists and digital nomads coming over and gentrifying Mexico City. There's been other ones where they're very tired of the migrants who are coming up from their southern border, right? From the other Central American countries. And now here you have them as well, protesting against the crime, the cartels, the corruption. We'll get into it, guys, and I'll kind of explain the connection here to Trump in America in today's video. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. That's the best way to support our work, but it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all of the latest news and coverage. And with that said, so here is the event that some are deeming January 6th. I didn't make that up. I saw someone else say that. But yeah, here's the scene as these protesters indeed attempt to storm the National Palace. There's tear gas, there's violence, there's chaos going on. It's certainly a riot, but take a look. Yeah, so certainly you can tell it is a heated and dramatic conversation. Let's make it clear for YouTube guidelines that in no way are we celebrating or condoning violence, but I think it is important to understand why the citizens are actually upset, right? What is truly happening in this country and what is the long trend of actual violence from the cartels that's gone abetted by the government that is now spawning a violent reaction and an angry reaction from the citizens. Again, not me defending the violence, YouTube. I'm just explaining, right, what the anger here, what the kind of triggering factor in all of these protests are. And what you just saw apparently in this video is the wall that the Mexican government tried to erect outside of the National Palace. They apparently thought that this would stop people from protesting, and then they tore down the wall, you know? Anthony Cabasa here says, President Sheinbaum thought that erecting a wall would stop Mexicans from getting into a place. I mean, hey, he said that, not me. Solid point, though, right? Solid point. You cannot stop their resolve. You thought this was going to stop them, you know? But yeah, this was the situation all day, right? You can see here very violent and heated clashes with the police. It's total chaos in the Capitol. And that said, here is an article that kind of explains what is actually happening, because it might be a little confusing. So from the AP, a few thousand people took to the streets of Mexico City on Saturday to protest growing crime, corruption, and impunity. That meaning impunity for the crimes, as you know, if you know anything about Mexico, right? In a protest organized by members of Generation Z, but which ended with strong backing from older supporters of opposition parties. For context, the current president of Mexico is basically like from the more left-wing socialist camp. Okay, in several countries this year, members of the demographic group born between the late 90s and early 2010s have organized protests against inequality, democratic backsliding, and corruption. Now, it's worth noting, some of these have been more left-wing protests, right? There's a lot of socialist undertones to many protest movements out of Latin America, but now that's at least starting to turn, or it's less becoming about, say, even the economic situation, and more so like, can we stop getting killed out in the streets? Which is, you know, I guess a consequence, right, of everything you've seen in that country. But anyways, the largest Gen Z protest took place in Nepal in September following a ban on social media. And that led to the resignation of that nation's prime minister. Some of you guys might have seen what happened there. Now, in Mexico, many young people say they are frustrated with systemic problems like corruption and impunity for violent crimes. Again, this is the very issue of the cartels buying off the Mexican government. By the way, you don't think that type of stuff happens in America as well? Let me tell you, it might not be as deep as Mexico, but it's absolutely the same situation. You wonder, even in some of these deep blue cities, why there is such a lax attitude on crime. Have you considered the fact that perhaps the criminal organizations have a backdoor into the local government? I mean, that's usually the case, is it not, after all? You know? Whether that's Portland with Antifa, I think that's the clearest example we prove, right? The people committing violence in that city basically have the backing, if not directly have the backing of the local government. But hey, look a little deeper. Who knows in a lot of the cities with heavy gang violence, heavy cartel influence? I mean, isn't it just kind of coincidental that, for instance, in California, where they passed all these laws and dismantled the police essentially, you also have a massive presence of, many of the same Mexican and Latin American cartels that are operating with impunity south of the border as well, but also north of the border? Just something to think about. That's why I say this stuff matters, right? It absolutely does impact us in a positive way. If somehow the country of Mexico can be positively reformed to be like an actual stable country, not a narco state, right? So that's why, again, I'm taking so much interest in this. Anyways, one guy right here, Andres Massa, who is a 29-year-old business consultant who carried the pirate skull flag that has become a global symbol of Gen Z protests, said, quote unquote, "We need more security." And yes, after all, what a radical claim. Hey, can I live in a safe country that's not overrun by crime? I'm sure Democrats in America will say that this kid is simply being brainwashed by Trump, but clearly that's not the case, right? Clearly, normal people, even in second or third world countries, don't like the cartels either, Democrats. But for some reason, the Democrat Party... Wait a minute. What did I just say about the back door into the political parties? I'm just saying. Anyways, Erisbeth Garcia, a 43-year-old physician who joined the protest, said she was marching for more funding for the public health system and for better security, because doctors, quote, are also exposed to the insecurity gripping the country, you don't say, where you can be murdered and nothing happens. So this is what these citizens are demanding to their government. Hey, when the cartel murders someone, can you actually prosecute the crime? Of course they don't. Because again, they're bought out by the cartels. But I'm still seeing these parallels to Democrats in America. Why don't Democrats prosecute crime? What's with the connection there, right? Because it usually makes common sense if you are trying to actually lead society in a positive way to prosecute crime. But of course, when you're not, or you're doing so very weakly, it's very hard not to believe that there are ulterior motives and interests going on there. And Mexico is a prime example. Just going to bring that up again. But anyways, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum still has high approval ratings despite a recent spate of high-profile murders that includes the assassination of a popular mayor in the western state of Michoacan, however you say that. And some of you guys might have seen that news from just a couple weeks ago where, yes, you just saw another assassination of a Mexican politician. It's pretty normal in the Mexican election cycle. You'll just see dozens of assassinations by the cartels of political candidates because, after all, if they can't control them, if they believe that those politicians would be a threat to the cartels, of course, what happens? And just weeks ago, we did see more peaceful protests, but protests nonetheless over that as well. Now, look, I certainly don't claim to be an expert on this Mayor Carlos Manzo or his politics, but according to Mexicans themselves, that's exactly what they're saying. Quote, the state is dying, and he was killed because he was a man who was sending officers into the mountains to fight delinquents. He had the guts to confront them, and obviously, what do they do in response? They try to kill the guy for doing the right thing. Now, I would like to note, first of all, again, this is completely normal in Mexico. It's not a rare occurrence whatsoever. It's not an isolated mafia hit or something, okay? This is how Mexican politics is. But secondly, to the people who, of course, thought it was so controversial for Trump to designate these Latin American cartels as terrorist organizations, the Democrat argument was basically that is a civil liberties overreach because they're really no different than street gangs and they don't meet the formal definition of a terrorist organization. I point this out right here, right? This is not just about selling drugs on the corner, okay? These people, for instance, are fighting a guerrilla war against the state and federal governments in the middle of the mountains. They're assassinating politicians constantly who are not in line with the agenda of the cartels. And even now, what are they doing, right? They're putting bounties on the heads of ICE agents and immigration officials that work for the Trump government in the United States. These are all the behaviors of terrorist organizations. So yeah, there you essentially have it. Now, if you're watching this as an American citizen and thinking to yourself, well, this story is cool. It's cool to see that the Mexican citizenry are rising up and fed up with the narco-terroristic rule of their country. But what exactly does that have to do with me? Let me tell you right now, the answer is everything, okay? Because unlike many of these stupid regime change wars that our government has pursued in faraway lands, right? We're going to topple the dictatorship of Ugubu Laladistan in order to give them democracy or something like that. No, this one actually does affect your life. Because it should go without saying that it matters whether or not the country that directly borders us, and by the way, I would argue all of the countries in that connected part of the hemisphere, whether or not they're stable places or ones ruled by hostile narco-terrorist regimes, whether directly or indirectly. And the reasons for that should be obvious, but let us start with the elephant in the room, which is simply the drug problem, right? Everyone knows. How do these cartels make money? By trafficking drugs to the United States as their primary market there. And in the process, what are they doing? First of all, they're bringing rampant, violent crime and gang problems to our streets because a lot of that is connected to drug trafficking itself, okay? So you wonder, you're tired of street crime? Connect that directly. A lot of that is to the cartel, right? It's not all just random. That's number one. But of course, secondly, we know they are killing more Americans every single year, hundreds of thousands of them, more than the entire Vietnam War. More than 9/11, you can make a strong case that the cartels do more to damage America on a daily basis than even Islamic terrorists and Al-Qaeda do. And so, yes, it absolutely matters, but that's only the surface of this issue. Let me bring up the second point, which is migration. Because if you're at all concerned or you're against the fact that Mexico and many Latin American countries have sent like millions of illegal migrants up north through the years, understand that a lot of that is actually directly tied to the cartels themselves for two reasons. First and foremost, because the cartels are the ones, as you may know, that actually sponsor all of these caravans who cross the border, right? The media and Democrats often frame it as some story of, oh, well, these innocent families just want to come to the United States, they're refugees. No, they're being human trafficked into this country by the cartels. So you shut down the cartels, you also shut down the border invasion basically in itself. But of course, secondly, talk about the root causes, right? Kamala Harris, a lot of leftists try to bring this up, but they don't even understand what they're really saying, the root causes of migration. There is some truth in the fact that, yes, a lot of people who come from Mexico and Central America are fleeing this violence. They're fleeing the many problems that cartel rule has brought to their country. So, in turn, what would happen? if you shut down cartels, if you made more stable governments in Latin America that were anti-cartel instead of pro-cartel, not only would you probably see more cooperations from the governments themselves to stop the trafficking of people into our country, of migrants into our country, but secondly, you'd probably see less incentive even for those people to want to come themselves. And so what I have often said is that, again, despite all of the regime changes we did in the Middle East and I don't know who knows where else, okay, it's just constant nonsense, Africa, etc. If the CIA is going to meddle in the affairs of foreign countries, if we're going to do regime changes, or at least affect regime changes, okay, I'm not calling for a violent invasion of Mexico, but if, color revolutions, what our government does, we play some games, right? Why haven't we tried to affect that kind of regime change in, say, Mexico? Why are we not trying to prop up Nayib Bukele-style presidents in every Latin country that is having these problems? Because after all, again, those things affect us, right? That directly affects how many illegal migrants come to our border. It directly affects how much drugs and crime flows into our cities, right? Like, I am against the neocons, but I am not necessarily against intervention or even imperialism, you might call it. And you might say, how are those things compatible? I thought that's what the neocons are all about. No, the reason I oppose the neocons is because the interventions that they have pursued in faraway lands have very little tangible benefit to the American people at enormous cost to the American people, okay? And it's all about their own interests, whatever, but I am absolutely for intervening when you can directly say, hey, look, this affects the people in this country. Again, not calling for an invasion, but play your game, CIA, if you want. I would endorse that, right? When it comes to the fact that just south of our border, for example, you have all these problems that are flowing into the United States, then yes, the United States does have a direct interest in Mexican politics, okay? So I guess in that sense, I'm not an isolationist, but what I do believe is in basically the kind of historical classical idea of American imperialism as opposed to the new wave of neoconservatism, because a lot of historic American presidents did believe that the United States should basically have a monopoly over our own hemisphere. That's where the Monroe Doctrine, for instance, comes from. That's even where a lot of the Reagan interventions in Latin America that are heavily criticized by modern people in general come from. And I look even back at those times and say, okay, the neocon invasion, for instance, of Iraq or toppling Libya, all this stuff. Yeah, it was stupid. But you mean to tell me there's not a strong case to be made that, hey, you have pro-Soviet left-wing communist governments rising just south of your border. Of course, America should take interest in that. Of course, that matters to us. And as the same thing matters to the cartel issue today, right? I would argue back in the 1950s, it was a massive mistake for the U.S. to kind of withdraw support for Bautista and essentially allow Castro to rise. And I always thought it was really stupid that America decided, the military-industrial complex wants a war, but let's do the war in Vietnam instead of Cuba. Like, should it not be of a bigger interest? Hey, you have a communist government 90 miles from your freaking country. Obviously, that matters to you, right? And I think Americans should have these viewpoints. That's why, by the way, I also support right now what the Trump administration is doing in Venezuela. And a lot of people say, oh, you're a neocon for that or something. It's like, no. It's different. You don't understand it's different. Because I don't personally care in the modern day, what type of government Venezuela has, if they're socialist or not socialist. What I do care about is the fact that, as Trump often brings up, they engage in hostile acts against this country when they, of course, have emptied their prisons and sent not just a bunch of their migrants to our country, but actively Tren de Aragua members, right? They're worst people that they knew would terrorize and destabilize and cause problems in the United States. And now, if you don't know anything about the context there, are refusing to take them back, right? We cannot support Venezuelans back to Venezuela out of our own country because they basically decide they want to violate international law and not repatriate their own citizens or something like that. And it's like, again, I'm not calling for an Iraq-style invasion of that country either, but you don't think it's good that the Trump administration's putting pressure on that country, right? No, they sponsored the migrant invasion actively as a government. They're refusing to take their people back. They're sending criminals to our country with the intent to kill Americans. That's what I care about. And it's the same thing here with Mexico, right? I don't necessarily care what their internal politics are. I care that an issue like this cartel problem, right, is affecting our day-to-day lives here in America. And that's why I'm proud to see what's happening right now. How much of it is organic? How much of it is it kind of being propped up by potentially the CIA, some type of color revolution? I have absolutely no idea. I'd guess most of it is organic. But again, to the CIA, in this case, I say, hey, you want to use your shady tactics for good for once? Use it on this, right? It should actually be U.S. policy to, first of all, care about our hemisphere, care about the politics of our hemisphere, and intervene, do what's necessary to make sure that America stays safe by not having violent narco states just south of our border that will inevitably bring their problems here. It's the same debate over the Panama Canal, by the way. Remember that? Yeah, the U.S. should care that our most vital shipping corridor to us, right, is basically being bought and owned by and controlled right now by China. So, anyways, with that said, though, guys, let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. Do you like my kind of assessment of, again, the difference between neoconservatism, this like globalist, internationalist ideology of, oh, we have to install democracy in Iraq versus we don't care about this democracy crap or whatever. We just want a foreign policy that makes sure the countries closest to us, right, are not bringing their problems to our country. That's all we care about, right? It's all about us at the end of the day. But when things directly affect us, we should care, But let me know your thoughts. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new. And until next time, God bless and peace.